Now, um, one of the things that we were looking for when we were thinking about how we would start these online conferences was to give a really, someone who has been a leader in the field for many years, to bring them to this conference and to give them an opportunity to speak to audiences in Australia. And of course, now we've all been on Zoom so much, we've become quite familiar with the technology, and we all seem to be on it probably more than we'd like. But one of the opportunities that that brings us is to kind of give us access to people from all around the world, to give us a sense of the kind of latest research in creativity and how that links with schools. And when we were thinking about someone who could bring that all together, who had a connection between schools and creativity and has been in the lead, has been a leader in the field, one of the people that came straight to our mind was Ron Beghetto. Dr. Ron Beghetto is an internationally recognised expert on creative thought and action in educational settings. He holds the Pinnacle West Presidential Chair and serves as a professor in the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. On a personal note, I've heard Ron speak on many occasions, and what I think he does so well, so succinctly, so thoughtfully, is he links what's going on in research to what's actually going on in the classroom at the teacher and student level. And it's really my very great pleasure to welcome Ron to this first OnCon.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that gracious introduction. And thank you, Robin, for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. And I just want to also thank Zoe for that beautiful acknowledgement of country. I think that's something we must all do worldwide, to pause and honor the indigenous peoples on the lands around us, and also recognize, just take time to recognize the beauty and privilege that we have to, you know, be where we are in these beautiful spaces, and to come together virtually to share. So thank you, Zoe, again. Thank you all for attending. Good morning. It's evening here, early evening. Dusk is on the horizon. But I'm thrilled to be here to talk with you and share with you and learn from you this idea of creativity under uncertainty. So uncertainty is something we're all certainly living with at this point. And I'm going to share my screen now. I have prepared a few slides to kind of help focus us a little bit. But what I'd like to do is rapidly get to the conversation. I think that's where the real learning happens. I know that's where I learn the most as well. So I'm going to share my slides here and highlight this idea that my central argument, and this has been a key strand in my program of research as of late, is this idea that uncertainty really is the catalyst and condition by which we engage in new thought and action, which is creativity, but also learning. And so it can certainly be an opportunity. So how can we kind of leverage the opportunities that uncertainty provides in an effort to take steps towards transforming schooling? And I think when we bring the arts together and educators together, and we're thinking about how to do this, I think creativity can really be enlivened if we kind of rethink our relationship with uncertainty. So that's what I invite you to do today. So I want to start with the kind of premise that I believe we probably all share, or we wouldn't be at the Create webinar. But this is an assertion that not all people necessarily see as the case, particularly young people. And that is that all people, all young people, have creative potential. And so I think this is a really important thing to remind ourselves of, but also the young people that we might work with, to ensure that they understand that everybody has creative potential. All humans have that. It's not something that needs to be given to them, and it's not something that can be taken away from them. Everybody, as part of being human and being alive, is somebody who can think and act in creative ways. So I think that's a key premise. Now, the interesting thing then is, if you consider some of the research and some of our own kind of personal experiences in this odd place called school, we see some things that might kind of counteract this notion that all young people have creative potential. So I just want to share with you the results of one finding from a recent study that was published by some of my colleagues, Jean Pretz and James Kaufman. And what they were looking at was admissions data into university. And so they looked at secondary school students entering into university, and they looked at a variety of different variables. One of the variables they looked at is this idea of creative self-efficacy. So that's something I've been working on for quite some time in my work. One way to think about creative self-efficacy, it's really just creative confidence. It's a self-belief. It's the belief that you yourself can come up with new ideas, good ideas, that you have a good imagination. And so that's kind of the basis for creative action. If you don't believe you could be creative, then why would you even try? And so I think this is a really important first step, is helping young people develop their creative confidence so that they can kind of realize their creative potential. So what they looked at is the relationship between creative self-efficacy or creative confidence and school rank, high school rank. And high school rank is, in the States, they rank students by level of class. They literally give them a numerical ranking. So, you might be top of your class or third highest in, academic performance in your class, of a class that could be about 500 students, for example. And what they found was there was a negative significant correlation between creative self-efficacy and high school rank. So on average, what this means, the way they kind of interpret this, is the more academically successful young people were in high school, on average, the more likely they didn't see themselves as being creative, or they had less likely to have higher levels of creative confidence. So why might be this the case, right? What's going on here? And I think you could probably all think about that, and I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts. This is something I've thought about a lot. Why aren't we seeing more kids recognizing their creative potential and putting that to use? And one reason that I would argue, and this is kind of another feature of my work, is that I think we tend to overplan young people's learning experiences, or any experiences that we design for young people. If we're designing a vacation, right? Planning a vacation, or planning a lesson, or planning, an extracurricular activity. I would argue that we tend to overplan these experiences. And so what is the problem with doing that? Well, let me just kind of work through these kind of elements of the prototypical learning experience. So I would argue there's at least these 4 elements in any designed learning experience. We usually have some task or problem for the students to solve. And of course, we define what that is as educators, so that's predetermined. We then have kind of a process or procedure for them to approach and complete that task or solve that problem. And that also is predetermined. Then we have a set of predetermined criteria by which we determine whether or not the students were able to successfully work through that process, resulting in a predetermined outcome or product. So everything is predetermined in advance. So in other words, students are being asked to complete problems that have already been solved. They're other people's problems, and there's a process for doing it. And the way we kind of determine whether they're successful is, did they match what was expected? So students learn from a very early age that when they're asked, even in a very kind of compelling question or task, oftentimes they learn that the way to be successful is to meet the expected criteria by providing not only what is expected, but how it's expected. And this kind of goes back to something that Zoe mentioned, this idea of recognizing the importance of difference. In schools, we tend to privilege sameness, right? We tend to privilege, can kids arrive at the same outcome in the same way at the same time? Whereas creativity not only honors difference, it requires difference, right? Creativity is all about difference. So one way to think about creativity is meeting predetermined criteria in different ways. And so I think that's an important thing to think about. One of the reasons why we hear these kind of, I think, hyperbolic statements like schools kill creativity. That's not really true, because as long as there's life, there's creativity, but it can stifle creativity if everything is predetermined and we kind of engineer out opportunities for difference. Or when a student does share something in a different way, even if it is a successful way of meeting the criteria, they might be dismissed, sometimes gently. I call that killing ideas softly. And as an educator, I've done that myself, like, oh, well, that's interesting. Let's get back on track here. Why don't you think about that some more? And in truth, that just stifles the child and tells them that's not what I'm looking for. So I think this is kind of the prototypical framework of the way we typically design tasks. And we kind of inherit this as educators. We're taught this in our teacher preparation programs. I've used these kinds of approaches myself, but the unintended and I think problematic consequence of doing so is we provide very little room for creativity to manifest. And one reason I would argue that is the case, so again, this is another way of kind of thinking through this, where success becomes defined as doing what's expected and how it's expected. So again, the prototypical formula of success in schools is that we are, again, engineering out uncertainty. And I think we have good reason for doing this. So what we do as educational designers or adults that are designing learning experiences for young people is that we try to remove uncertainty. And I think the reason we do this is because it is kind of a challenge to our identity as an educator or a parent or a coach if we don't know what's going to happen next. What kind of teacher would I be if I didn't know where this lesson was going? So I think we've kind of inherited this component of our identity that we must know not only, what the next step is going to be, but, what the outcomes are going to look like, what processes students are going to use. So everything, again, is kind of prepackaged, and we try to erase uncertainty because we see that if we experience uncertainty as a potential signifier of our incompetence, not as a signifier of creative potential. So I want to kind of flip that. I want to challenge us to think about, can profound experiences with uncertainty even be moments of profound learning and creativity potentially? So let's talk, this is one of my favorite little images here. When we encounter uncertainty, we feel perhaps like this little fella facing this sumo wrestler, right? It's something that is not a pleasant experience. It could be terrifying to experience uncertainty. And I think we're experiencing that worldwide with COVID and all the things that are happening worldwide, that the uncertainty that those kind of evoke with us, and it's a very kind of personal, subjective thing, but it can also be kind of shared, is very discomforting. And as humans, we don't really enjoy uncertainty. And that's why uncertainty is kind of a motivator for action. So what I have kind of outlined, and I have this little link here, and I'll drop it in the chat as well. I have this little paper that if you're interested in reading more about it, I'm just going to throw it in the chat box here, the same little link. You can go to it, where I go a little bit further into this idea. But the idea here is there's a range of ways that we can experience uncertainty, because uncertainty is a state of doubt. And as one of the favorite pragmatists of mine stated many years ago, who was an influence on John Dewey and also William James, his name was Charles Sanders Peirce. He was somewhat of an obscure and cantankerous individual, so much of his work didn't actually get out there. But one of the things he talked about is the only way we generate new ideas, new ways of thinking and acting, is when we experience states of genuine doubt. Now, isn't that a beautiful concept? States of genuine doubt, where our typical ways of reasoning no longer work for us. The way that's always worked in the past is failing us now. We can't kind of reason our ways through it with induction or deduction. So what Peirce talked about is we need a new form of reasoning, what he called abductive reasoning, or what I would call creative reasoning. So this has been something more than 100 years ago thinkers have really kind of delved into to really understand, where do new thoughts come from? However, the way we encounter uncertainty and experience it will determine whether that leads to new thought or action or not. So I would argue there's a continuum that runs from experiencing uncertainty and wanting to quickly eliminate it or try to avoid it proactively. There's entire fields of study that are on risk management and uncertainty management, where people try to anticipate and eliminate potential uncertainties. Teachers are actually taught to do this in their planning. When I was a middle grades teacher, I remember I would think through my lesson and imagine myself as a student trying to destroy the lesson. What would I do to just take this off the rails? So I would try to anticipate that so I can kind of plan away any uncertainties. So on one end of the continuum is this idea of trying to manage it, mitigate it, quickly resolve it, or never encounter it in the first place. On the other end of the continuum is this idea of perhaps when we experience uncertainty, we should sit with it. We should engage it. We should even try to sustain it. And as educators, perhaps we should even invite it into our designs. So I want you to think about perhaps where you fall out on this continuum of uncertainty. And of course, it varies by situation. But in general, if you are involved in planning learning experience for folks, where do you see yourself in the design process when it comes to uncertainty? Is it something you try to plan away, or actually invite or plan into or design into the learning experiences that you're designing? So my assertion is uncertainty does disrupt our routines and habits, but it's a sign that new ways of thinking and acting are needed. And so in this conceptualization, uncertainty, as I mentioned at the very beginning, serves as a catalyst and a condition for learning and creative expression. So let's kind of delve into this a little bit. I just want to start by saying we don't always need to think and act in different and creative ways. If we know how to get from A to B and it's working sufficiently well and it's not having unintended negative consequences, then by all means, let's kind of move from A to B. I don't think we need to do that. And the kind of thought experiment I used to use, which is kind of dated now because not many folks are traveling by airplane, but the one I used to use, so if I was actually visiting in person, would be if we're on a routine flight flying over a body of water like the ocean, the last thing we'd want to hear is the captain coming on and saying, this is a routine flight, we're going over this body of water. I've been thinking this, everything's fine, but I've been thinking about this creative water landing. I'm going to give it a shot right now. Absolutely not. That would be a terrifying thing to hear. But if the plane was in trouble and going down, then by all means, we'd want the pilot to pull out the creative stops. So I think that's an important distinction. Part of what we want to do to help develop kids and young people's creative confidence is to build their creative metacognition. And what that means is just being aware of the situation, aware of their own knowledge, aware of their own strengths, and thinking through, is it worth the risk? Is this the time and the place to try to do something different? Or if I try to do something different in this space, might it lead to an unintended or potentially negative consequence? So that's something I think we can help young people understand is, in the laboratory, when you're working with dangerous chemicals, you might not want to come up with your own safety protocols. You might want to follow what's well established. But when you're doing something else, perhaps, yes, of course, your own unique way of sharing seems both warranted and important if, in fact, it's going to be recognized and acknowledged by your peers and the educator. So in this configuration then, when do we need creative thought and action? I would argue is when we encounter uncertainty. So I mentioned this earlier, when trying to get to A to B, what we've typically done no longer works. And sometimes this happens for very good students who end up, for example, in university, they've been extremely successful in primary and secondary school, and all of a sudden, for the first time in their lives, they hit an impasse, and it's not working for them. So in this moment, this is, I think, an opportunity to help ourselves and the young people we work with recognize this is a chance for us to think and act in new ways, to generate multiple possibilities and try to find the most viable one. So that's an encounter with uncertainty when it kind of surprises us. And then the second case is when we're actually trying to design with uncertainty in mind. So anytime we want to improve a practice, so maybe A to B still works in some ways, but we want to improve upon it, or we want to change it, or we want to kind of infuse new artistic or aesthetic experiences, or we just want to engage in creative expression, then we're inviting uncertainty. And then again, it would be appropriate for us to generate new possibilities for doing so. So in the paper, I talk about this idea that not all experiences with uncertainty motivate new ways of thinking or acting. So regardless of whether they're encountered or we design them and invite them into our experiences, the way in which we personally encounter them is going to be very different. And so what I talk about is there's these different levels of intensity. So the lowest level of intensity is what I call mundane uncertainty. So this might be, what am I going to eat later after this webinar? I'm not sure, but it's not something that's going to stop me and, make me kind of sign off and kind of, ruminate over that or something. So they often go by without much notice or response. We just kind of, either we just ignore it and we'll kind of get to it when we need to, but they really don't kind of disrupt us and will motivate us for new ways of thought or action. At the other end of the extreme is what I call profound uncertainty. So these are uncertainties that strike us as completely unknowable. And these might be like these kind of metaphysical or existential issues that are so large that we feel like we couldn't possibly know what to do differently. And so we might resolve ourselves to kind of coexist with these as there's little we can do to address this kind of uncertainty. And then there's this kind of middle range that I call actionable uncertainty. And so this is what I'm most interested. So actionable uncertainty is when we do experience a state of genuine doubt. So we don't know how to think or act because the traditional ways or the typical ways we've done that are no longer working for us. It's risen to our level of awareness where it has become kind of uncomfortable for us. And importantly, we feel like we can do something about it, and we have a responsibility to do something about it, right? So we recognize that this is a sign that we need to do something differently. We can do it, and we have a responsibility to do it to kind of improve our situation, and more importantly, to improve the situation or the learning and lives of others. Now, what I would argue, and I want you to think about this, I would argue much of the uncertainties that we categorize as profound uncertainties that we can't do anything about are actually actionable uncertainties. I think a lot of times young people, when they're faced with uncertainties, they experience them as very profound, especially if it's the first time they've run into a situation like this. And I think what we can help them to do is understand what aspects of that are actually actionable, that they can in fact do something differently about it. And I think even with things like COVID and so on, there are aspects of that that certainly are actionable. There are actions that we can and are taking. So I think part of this is reframing and thinking, stopping, sitting with the uncertainty. Maybe we feel like it's very profound, but kind of revisiting that and challenging our own assumptions about that and thinking, is there something I could do, even in a small way? This is what I'm talking about, small steps towards transforming schooling that could actually lead to new thought and action and help us kind of address and resolve that uncertainty. So let's kind of revisit this quickly, and I will just kind of close with some examples to kind of apply this to practice, to make this applied and fulfill what Michael kind of promised, that I can kind of bring this theory into practice and this research into practice. So when we are experiencing actionable uncertainty, whether it's encountered or induced, I think there's a couple interesting ways to think about this. Encountered uncertainty emerges in this gap between the planned and the lived. And there is a curriculum theorist out of Canada who's passed on, named Ted Aoki, who had this beautiful way of describing this. What he talked about is when the lesson as planned meets the lesson as lived, there is this opening, this potential for creative action, new ways of teaching, new ways of learning, not just for the child, but the peers and the teacher, right? And so the idea here, and John Dewey talks about this, is to kind of develop our stamina to be able to sit with that uncertainty in that moment and to kind of take the moment to kind of explore it. Now, we might decide that we have to get back to the plan at hand, but at least we can acknowledge it and say, wow, this is interesting. I don't have the time to explore this today, but I'm going to write this on the chalkboard and I'm going to hold myself accountable. And you can see it up here that we will return to this next time we meet, for example. Or perhaps you decide to step into that gap and explore it. So this kind of in-between space is a powerful space for us as educators, as parents, as coaches. when something kind of emerges as educational leaders, that we can kind of sit with that and explore it and say, there's something happening here that's quite different than what's planned, and it's an opportunity for us to perhaps go in a different direction. So that's encountered uncertainty. Then this is what I'm really interested in, is this kind of induced or invited uncertainty. So uncertainty by design. So uncertainty by design is this blend of predetermined elements. So we still want to have the predetermined elements to kind of structure the experience, with to be determined elements. So if you are the designer of the experience as a classroom teacher or a curriculum designer, or anyone who's designing an experience, you have, I would argue, still the responsibility to design a little wireframe structure, if you will, that provides the criteria, also helps young people know how they can ask for help, right? How they can get the supports they need. So those are all the things that we can do as designers, while blending that with to be determined elements that the young people get to determine themselves. So that could be maybe determining their own problems to solve, or their own ways to solve them, or their own ways of demonstrating that they solve them, or all of the above, right? So this is a different way of design. And since I'm speaking to a lot of folks that are interested in the arts, one of my favorite kind of metaphors for this is the Picasso Bowl series. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Bowl series. I think there's like 11 in the series of lithographs. And when Picasso produced the very first of the Bowl series, it was a fully rendered bowl. And everyone in the lithograph space with him in the studio there, they all thought Picasso was done. I mean, it was a gorgeous, fully rendered bowl. So they were surprised when he went back and started producing the second iteration and the third, let alone the 11th. And the 11th iteration is just this little wireframe of a bowl. It's just like the essence, a one-line drawing of the bowl. And that's how it became Picasso, right? That's how it became art. That's how it became different. And so Picasso kind of knew this. I think artists know this, is that we have to kind of prune away. If you think about prune away all this excess structure and allow for the essence to be there, so that you can kind of fill the rest of it with your own experience. And in the case of education, with the young person's kind of learning experience and creative experience. So that's what the concept of uncertainty by design is really all about. And like I mentioned, it's really structured uncertainty. So we're not just kind of designing this open-ended, go learn, go forth and learn or something. We're actually providing some, here's some criteria. This is the amount of time you have. These are the guidelines. These are the criteria that you can check yourself against, but you're going to be doing these elements. And I genuinely don't know how you're going to do it. So I think those to be determined elements have to have some element of surprise, some aspect of genuine doubt for the designer. Otherwise, it becomes an artificially designed experiment. And so kids are pretty good at this. They don't trust many educators when they do this. They'll say, well, how do you really want me to answer this? What problem do you really want me to solve? And so we can kind of return to that, because they've had experiences where they've been invited to share their own ideas and then told the next moment, all ideas are welcome except for that one, right? So I think the idea is to be clear in the communication, to help young people know and to trust that you're actually asking them to take the kind of creative risks necessary, and that by doing so, they won't be dismissed or punished for it, that they will be supported in it. And sometimes that requires redirecting young people, of course, but the idea is to structure that clearly enough so students don't feel overwhelmed, they feel like it's actionable uncertainty, and they know how to get the supports when they need them. Okay, so what does this look like in practice? The LEGO Foundation, so I'm a creativity advisor for the LEGO Foundation, and they've just put out this publication called Assessing Creativity: A Palette of Possibilities. It's available free, and I'll see if I can find the link for that as well. And so in there, what I talk about is just different ways in which you can not only design the learning experiences, but also what we need to do differently about our assessments, because we all know what gets assessed matters. And so assessment kind of drives the day oftentimes, and sometimes unfortunately in classrooms. So what we want to be able to do in the prototypical experience, it's really our students matching what's expected across the board. So that's this kind of top layer here. But what if we open this up and we allow young people to come up with their own problem to define? So that's the to be determined element, even using a process that we taught and a product that we all know is going to be. So this is oftentimes in mathematics, for example. We might invite a young person to come up with a different problem using a process and coming up with an accurate solution. So in that case, how do you assess that? So what we'd be looking for is, did the child in fact come up with a different problem than the ones we showed in the example set, right? So, and that's how we'd be providing feedback and encouraging the student. And we wouldn't necessarily be grading the child on that, but we'd be providing feedback and saying, okay, I want you to push yourself a little bit more. We've heard that example previously. Can you come up with your own example? Can you put your own unique twist on it? So I just kind of go through these different iterations and show that you can open up what I call lesson unplanning. And the great thing I do when I do workshops with educators is just have them bring in a lesson that they feel is kind of something they dread teaching or students dread learning. And so it's kind of a low stakes experiment. They want to kind of change it anyway. And then we go through the process together and we start unplanning some of the over-planned, over-structured components, and then opening it up for young people to kind of take on some of that work. So kind of giving away some of the lesson, creating those openings so students can be creative, and it kind of breathes new life into that lesson for not only the students, but also for the educator. So those can be powerful experiences. What I want to ultimately move us towards, however, is panel E at the very bottom here, where the complexity is at maximum because there's so much more uncertainty, and there's fewer or the fewest number of predetermined elements. So perhaps the only predetermined elements are the criteria. And even those, you can invite young people into helping you define those criteria depending on the subject matter or the context. But it's in that space where I think the most profound creative potential lies, and also the most profound potential to change what we mean by schooling, because it often pushes learning beyond the walls of the classroom. So let's take a look at this a little bit more closely. I developed this curriculum, and I designed this curriculum when I was directing Innovation House at the University of Connecticut. So these were young people coming in to university who wanted to be innovators. And this curriculum is for elementary, the youngest levels of elementary, kindergarten, all the way through university and graduate school. And the idea here is to invite young people to be the directors of their own creative endeavors and creative learning. And the most important thing about a legacy challenge is that they're not just designing something to benefit themselves, like starting a company to become rich or something like that, but they're trying to design something, and it could be a social solution, a club, it could be a product, it could be anything. But the idea is that it's going to make a positive and lasting contribution in the learning and lives for others. And so these kinds of projects are for students, by students. They provide an opportunity to respond creatively to uncertainty. They focus on both process and product. It's problem solving throughout the entire process. They're collaborative endeavors. These things require young people and classroom teachers to partner with outside experts. So this could be the wisdom in the home of a child, or the neighborhood, or the community, or the nation that they live in, or even globally, right? This kind of work should be exhibited and curated so other people could kind of benefit from it, other learners, other educators. And the idea here is they should be never-ending projects, that they kind of disrupt the macaroni art phenomena, right? And even technology, I think 3D printers and so forth really have become like high-tech macaroni art generators. And so the idea here is you're not just producing something that's going to go in the bin or on a shelf, but actually these are things that are going to live on. So that if someone's graduating from secondary school, going on to university, or going into the world of work, that they brought in younger students to carry the work forward, right? So or if a young child's going on to secondary school, they brought in other younger students to carry the work forward. So that's kind of the legacy component of this as well. So it's really based on 4 simple questions. This is a shameless plug for my book, What If, where I outline this in detail. But really, you don't need this. You just need, this is the framework right here. This is the wireframe. The wireframe is you are asking young people to identify a problem that matters to them that perhaps no one else even recognizes as a problem. So that's to be determined by the student. Then you ask them to really build a case and be able to communicate that case of why does that matter? Why does it matter if we solve this? Why are you the one going to be to solve it? How do you know it's a problem, right? So we engage in possibility thinking, but also challenging our assumptions around it. So it's not only about identifying the problem, it's about being able to communicate that and persuade other people that this is something worth tackling. And the reason why we do this is because young people are going to usually have to partner with someone outside of their classroom to actually do something about this problem. So once they kind of get that clear, then they can start talking to other experts. They could be collecting data, they could be doing surveys, they could be doing a needs assessment and figure out what is the scope of the problem, and then start thinking about what are we going to do about it. And something young people have a hard time doing is sometimes differentiating between a problem and a solution. So at Innovation House, I would say, what kind of problem do you want to solve? And like I said earlier, most of my students didn't trust me and my graduate student team that we were actually wanting to hear their problem. They said, well, what kind of problem should we solve? And we said, this is your chance to be an innovator, not a spectator of your learning, right? So you get to come up with the problem. So then they would say, well, I want to develop an app, but that's a solution, right? So what we learned is to help young people really sit with the problem, to engage in what creativity researchers call problem finding. One of the earliest studies in the field of creativity studies is two scholars looked at art students at the University of Chicago. So it was Csikszentmihalyi and Getzels. And together, what they did is they put this kind of display of art artifacts that you could use in kind of a drawing or a painting on one table, and then they had a table that was empty, and they invited these art students to manipulate the objects however they wanted, and then to represent them however they wanted in some sort of artistic drawing. And what they found was interesting. Some art students took those objects, set up something, and got straight to work and spent the majority of the time, producing their artwork. Other students took those materials, put them on the table, fiddled around with them, looked at them, smelt them, did things that artists do with objects, right? Looked them around, kept going back and forth, spent a lot more time kind of fiddling around with the objects, exploring the different objects and kind of changing their mind, and then got to the business of actually producing an artwork. And then they brought in some independent experts, which were professors at art school, right? Some people might challenge that, but these were experts in the arts. So they independently rated these productions, and they did it blindly. They didn't know the students that did this. And they tended on average to rate higher in originality the art that was produced by the students who spent more time engaging with the problem, right? That's how they came up with the concept of problem finding. It's just exploring the problem rather than just thinking you have it and getting straight to work. So that's another thing we sometimes have to help ourselves and young people understand, that it's okay to spend more time on the problem, to kind of let go of a good problem in search of a better problem. It's okay, and I think a beautiful moment, which I don't think I've ever seen happen in school, if someone's writing a term paper or producing a project, and then the day before it's due decides they have another idea that they want to pursue, and they set that down and they just get started on this new one. So they could still, what if they had an exhibition of learning where they said, I spent all this work on this and it actually led me to this, and I only have a thesis statement, but it's a clear one and I'm passionate about it. I don't think that's a problem, but I don't think we often get to see that in school. And so then the last component of this is, once students have partnered with other people and they get the resources they need, then it's really throughout the process thinking about how can we make sure this makes a lasting positive contribution? How are we going to monitor progress? How are we going to make sure this isn't creating more of a problem or having unintended consequences? And how can we make sure this work lives on? That's all designed by the young people. And all that we do as the educators is facilitate this by establishing crystal clear criteria and supports so that students don't become overwhelmed. Okay, we're in the home stretch here. I'll show this. This is a little one-page canvas that I use that has questions that young people can kind of work through, and it's kind of a living document. So it kind of unpacks those 4 questions with a couple additional questions, like who's going to help us, who are we helping, what materials do we need, how do we monitor progress, how do we monitor the impact that we're making. Okay, here's an example. So one of my doctoral students was observing a 4th grade, year 4 classroom in Connecticut. And there were a lot of young people there who had just come from Korea. So they were learning English. English was at least their second language. So they were English language learners. And one young boy who had been at the school and was heading back to Korea produced this little book, and here's the cover of the book, and he called it a survival guide for newcomer Korean students in the school. And so I'll show you a couple pages, and I would argue this is a legacy project that this kid produced. This kid talks about these different spaces that as a student coming to the US who doesn't speak the language very well was finding very frightening. So one of the places was a school bus. So in the school bus, it's kind of scary for some reason because it could be bullying or bullies on your bus. And so the bus driver can be strict or scary or even mean. But at the end of each of these, the child says, but you know, it'll all work out. There's good people there and it'll be okay. So good luck, right? And so the interesting thing, the kid wrote this in English and in Korean. And the part of the reason he wrote in Korean is not only for the Korean speaking kids, but so that the teachers could have an English Korean version as well, and they could share this with any kids coming in. So he was thinking of audience with respect to teachers, peers who may or may not speak Korean, and peers who do speak Korean who are trying to learn English. Here's another page from that book. Lunch and recess. At lunch, you'll get surprised because there's lots of people talking and screaming. But if you find a friend to talk with, it wouldn't be that loud as it was. And at recess, you feel free to play sports and games. And it's the best time to make some new friends. So again, identifying these spaces that adults might not have even seen as a problem, like lunch and recess is a scary space for young people. This is an opportunity where this kid had creative voice, creative confidence, took the risk, produced this artifact that actually is now living on. And so subsequent generations of these kids coming in are producing their own digital narratives of these kinds of experiences. Teachers are using this book to teach with. So he left behind this kind of creative artifact for young people. So what we've talked about, and I want to move to Q&A, is creativity under uncertainty, and how if we kind of rethink our relationship with uncertainty, we are going to be in a better position, not only for ourselves to think and act in new and needed ways, but to support young people in taking that kind of beautiful risk to develop the confidence in their own ideas and creative actions, and to share those out in benefit of others. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. That was really a very exciting way to start the conversation. So very much looking forward to the Q&A session that we're going to have now. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat box down the side. And I think the first question I want to ask is, we have a schooling system that is basically allergic to doubt and uncertainty. And we hear schools saying a lot of time that their students are anxious about uncertainty and want to get the right answer all the time. I wonder if you could talk to the kinds of processes that we need to use to move from where we are now with a lockdown kind of response to schooling to a more a space that embraces uncertainty.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. That's a great question. You know, the interesting thing that I've found is it's not just the people who are in school and policymakers and so on, it's students themselves. Some of the most successful students are the most kind of doubt or uncertainty phobic because they've learned the game of school. They've learned that the game of school is really just do what's expected and how it's expected. And they become very facile at trying to figure out, okay, what exactly, even if the teacher's unclear, they're pretty good at figuring out, okay, so is this what you want? Is this what you want? And so what I learned the hard way is when I was trying this, rolling out some of these ideas at university with my students, the students really resisted this. They did not like the idea that I was asking them to step into uncertainty, and I was asking them to identify their own ways of doing things, their own ideas, because as many of them told me, they've never in their entire schooling career been asked to do so. They and even at a very deeper level, this is the level that we really need to think about. Their identity as students is threatened in that space. Right? It is so threatening to them that if they try something that doesn't work out, and they've had this identity as being the best and the brightest, that is a profoundly difficult thing for them to experience. So I've developed this project called My Favorite Failures, the My Favorite Failure Project. I can send out the invitation if you or anyone you know wants to contribute to it. But the idea is, and it starts with the educator, right? So when I start my classes out, I say, look, we're going to be taking risks in here, and learning and life are shot through with risk, and so is any creative endeavor. And so one thing you can count on with risk is failure and setbacks. And so let's go ahead and talk about our own failures, and I'll share a story of my own favorite failure. So the idea is you tell stories of your favorite failures. So what happened? What did you feel in that moment? So emotion is a key component of this. I think that's something, you know, we hear a lot about growth mindset and grit and all these different concepts, which sound great, right? But it doesn't sound so great when you've experienced failure, when you've been thrown off the sports team, you didn't make it, or, you know, somebody downgrades your artistic work, that you took a risk, or your poem, people laugh at you, or whatever the case may be, or it could be sciences or mathematics, whatever. And so it doesn't help to say, you know, this is, you know, grow from this, you know, have some grit. What I think people need to understand is that failure can be extremely a negative emotion. It can be extremely painful, right? But the idea is, so, you know, by sharing these stories of other young people, of ourselves with our students, by taking that risk and saying, here's something that happened to me. This is what I felt like in that moment. But this is what I learned about that situation, and this is what I learned about myself. And that's why it's one of my favorites, right? So we're inviting people to take failure head on, to talk about the emotions, the full range of emotions, but most importantly, to talk about the learning about whatever they were trying to accomplish and what they learned about themselves. So the requirement that I had at Innovation House, and I've worked with teachers that do this again at all grade levels, is we would have an exhibition of learning at the end of, you know, the project. So if we're doing a legacy challenge. So some of these projects that students put together are catastrophic failures. And I say that, I said, you know, this might not work out. That's one of our mottos, but we're going to learn from this. We're going to learn from this. So even if, regardless of whether you got funding to create your own company, or you created a new club at your school, or you've really done something profound, or if it was a major failure, regardless of that, that's going to be the background. The foreground is going to be you telling the story of that, what you learned, what you would have done differently, what you learned about yourself. So everybody gets to present. Even people who have nothing tangible to show, they can still show their learning. So I think that's one way to do it, is disrupt the conversation and really step into the space and normalize and prepare young people for failure. And I think we have to do that ourselves. We have to build trust by taking the risks ourselves, by showing our own vulnerabilities, and then students can. I don't think it's fair to ask students to do that unless we're willing to do that ourselves. So that would be one way of doing that, Michael.
Thanks. Thanks, Ron. So just to reiterate, if you want to ask your questions, ask it into the chat box. Man Chung from Shanghai has done that. Hi, Man Chung. Good to see you've joined us today. He says, I think as a creative practitioners, we have pretty good understanding of the potential of uncertainty in the educational setting. However, it seems to be completely against the neoliberal agenda driving most contemporary schools. How do we engage with administrators, policymakers and management to celebrate uncertainty over normalisation and standardisation? And I think, Ron, that relates to the earlier question, but what's the big argument that we have to make to our parents, to our community, to the administrators who hold the purse strings?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Min Chong, for saying that and for articulating that, Michael. So yeah, I would say it starts with the students, because the students are going to be some of the best spokespeople for the work, right? When parents and so on are seeing the kinds of work that young people are doing, it's going to be a very different flavor and quality than what they're used to. However, I think it's also important to prepare our colleagues, our educational leaders, administrators, policymakers for this work as well. And one way to do it is just to simply put those two things side by side, to juxtapose them. You could do this in a small way. You could say, okay, the prototypical way we teach mathematics is we teach a procedure for solving a particular type of mathematics problem. And then we assign young people for homework or in class, individual work, 12 or so of these kind of types of problems to be solved in this one way. Okay, that through rehearsal, you're going to learn that procedure. That's pretty surefire way of learning how to do something. What if we also, and this is just an empirical question you could test out in your own space and demonstrate to anybody who wants to see this. What if we said, okay, let's take one of those problems. We've taught one way of solving it. Now let's, for homework or individual time, have young people try to come up with as many different ways of solving one problem. And so in my book, Nurturing Creativity in the Classroom, there was a teacher in China who teaches this way, right? And so the idea was these kids generated more than a dozen unique and mathematically accurate ways of solving this one problem. Now, the beauty of doing this is then the kids share this out. So if I know one way of solving it, now I know at least 11 different ways. If I knew no way of solving it, now I have 12 different ways, and maybe I can finally figure it out, right? By seeing, and there are examples of this where young people explain something in different ways, and a kid can maybe relate to that better. Even as a teacher, if I knew 8 ways of solving it, now the children have introduced 4 new ways, right? So that's a small way of doing that. I think a bigger way of doing this is to get kids to do this kind of creative work, like these legacy challenges, where they are actually out of the school, in the communities, doing something that means something to them and makes a meaningful contribution to others. And they can point to that, and they can show, and I think it meets, you don't need a statistical test for this, it meets what I call the interocular traumatic test. It hits you right between the eyes. When people see that and say, these young kids made this, they restored this broken down bus stop, they created this skate park, they created this installation of art, my goodness, wow, right? That speaks volumes. And then quickly, policymakers that are doubting will say, look at what's happening in our district. Look what's happening in our town. Why isn't this happening more? We need to push this. So I think the work speaks for itself. And these are empirical questions that we can test in big and small ways. And to just show, I think, and we have a responsibility to demonstrate that, to say, this is something different. It doesn't mean we throw away the other ways of doing things. It's a both and. Let's try it both ways. So that would be a response to kind of other stakeholders. I think we have to demonstrate. That's why curating and exhibiting the work is so important as well. Thank you.
Great. Paul Gins asks, and Paul Gins is one of my colleagues and an educational psychologist in the Sydney School of Education and Social Work. And he asks about the role of improvisation in dealing with doubt and uncertainty, and whether, and I know Keith Sawyer's work here is critical, but I'm wondering what your thoughts on the role of improvisation is in this kind of process.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And yes, so Keith Sawyer has this idea of disciplined improvisation. And I've kind of worked on this a little bit as well. I think this is a key piece of when we are encountering uncertainty, to be able to kind of, in the spirit of improv, yes and the experience, right? To take a moment and not immediately, our hunch sometimes, and we do these teacherly moves that are meant to resolve the uncertainty and get back on track, which is, why don't you think about that some more? Can somebody else help this child out? I don't understand where it's coming from. But the improvisational move is to accept it as the kid is sharing something. And the thing about creativity, when a child says something unusual, we don't know if that child is misunderstanding something. So if we say, what's the definition of a hypothesis? What is a hypothesis? How do you define hypothesis? And a kid says it's a kind of animal. We don't know if that kid heard hippopotamus. We don't know if that kid's misunderstood what we said. We don't know if that child is willfully trying to disrupt the class, take things off the rails, or if there's something actually creative there. The only way of knowing that is to draw that out, which is what education means. Educare, to draw forth, to lead forth, to draw it out and see, what is it? Tell me more about this. Why are you saying it's a kind of animal? Well, what if that child says, well, you know, I actually designed an experiment where I tested the hypothesis about feeding animals two different kinds of food. Who knows, right? So the point is, we have to be willing to step into it, to yes and that moment. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't redirect, right? Sometimes we, again, need to redirect and say, okay, look, because the worst thing we've all experienced as students and educators is going down that curricular rabbit hole with a student's idea and disappearing, and the rest of the students are just sitting there like, what is happening here? So I think if we're not prepared, if we feel like we're completely going off the rails, we can stop ourselves and return to it later. But I think we have to be forthright in doing so and saying, look, I don't have the time to explore this now, but this is a really interesting thing. I want to hear more about it, and we will return to it. So I think either way, pedagogically speaking, whether it's misunderstanding, willful disruption, or creative ideation, it warrants exploration and instruction. Thank you, Paul, for that question.
Got a question from Charles Bisley, sorry. I'm interested in what you say about assessment. Maybe this is the hardest to deconstruct, but the most important. How do you assist children to make and inhabit the gap created by taking away teacher as evaluator, or even more, student as evaluator of a predetermined process?
Yeah, that's a great question, Charles. Thank you for asking that. I think part of it is to invite them into the process. And so you can use checklists and so on. And so I put together these very simple checklists where I kind of split apart. I think it's important to tease apart the academic component of it. So meeting the academic criteria. So if you're going to write a sonnet, there is an expected structure to the sonnet. So the space that you have an opportunity to be creative is the content of that sonnet. Same thing in mathematics. There might be one answer, but how you arrive at that answer could be novel and thereby creative. So I think what we want to ask young people to do is self-assess. Did you come up with a new way of doing this? Did you have some new ideas in your approach to doing this? Did you feel like you met the academic criteria? So I think having them reflect on that as you, the educator, are also reflecting on that, and then having a kind of an assessment conversation about that. And I think oftentimes it's interesting in some of the empirical studies that we've done, there are times when young people do something that other people, educators, might see as creative, but they themselves don't see it as creative. So I think that's an interesting moment when a child does something that's actually novel and accurate, thereby creative. They might not recognize it as creative. So I think part of it is giving them feedback and say, that's actually creative. That's a different way of doing that. That's your own kind of unique way of doing it. There are some kids who are really good at meeting criteria and are terrified of doing it in their own way. And so we can give them the feedback to push them, say, great, that's a procedure that you learned last year. It's pretty standard. Can you come up with a different way of doing that, right? So I think it's through assessment conversations where we open this up and challenge ourselves and our students to try to do something different, but still meet the criteria. So it's really, creativity in schooling is really about thinking creatively inside the box of often predetermined criteria. So I think one of the dangers of kind of slogans like think outside the box is life is filled with constraints, and the best creators know how to be creative within constraints. So creativity actually thrives in constraints, and so it doesn't become overwhelming for young people, and it's a way to check, okay, are they meeting the criteria, but are they doing it in a different way? So thank you, Charles. I hope that helps. But I'm interested in hearing, and I'm also interested in hearing disagreements or, you know, fits of rage or whatever.
I'm sure you'll get the whole spectrum.
Okay, good.
Frank Newman, who works at the Sydney Opera House, asks, when does uncertainty tip into ambiguity? Can we embrace ambiguity, and is a productive or intentional ambiguity? So I think what he's asking there is there a certain kind of ambiguity that produces creativity?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think the one way I've been really thinking through this, particularly in the context of education, is, a very simple way of saying this is there are times when uncertainty tips into ambiguity, or what I would call chaotic uncertainty. And this is where it becomes profound, where we don't know what to do next or how to do it, but we're also not feeling supportive. We're not feeling safe. We don't know. There's too much ambiguity. There's too much ambiguity that it becomes stifling and it immobilizes us. And the problem or challenge with that is that's a subjective judgment. So even though we as educators might feel like we're providing this very clear set of criteria and supports that are available, the student might still feel that it's too chaotic for them. And so we might have to add a little bit more structure back. So we might have to give them an example and say, here's one way that people have done this. Now do something different. You don't get to use this one way. But so I talk about part of this work is, and this gets back to the improvisational move. Sometimes we have to step in and add more structure than what we anticipated students need. Some students are going to need more structure. Other students are going to need less structure. So even though we feel like we've unstructured and opened enough uncertainty in the space, it's not enough to kind of provoke a child to think in new and different ways. So it is this kind of interesting tipping point where the uncertainty is structured by support and clear criteria, to the extent where people feel like they can actually take action on it. And that's a subjective judgment. So again, it's not something we can just design and send out there. We have to be in conversation with the people we're working with the students we're working with, to see how are you doing? Are you feeling overwhelmed by this? Do you feel like this is enough of a challenge for you? And watching their work, right? Providing feedback along the way to make sure that we step in and step out as appropriate, adding more structure as necessary and removing structure as necessary.
Next question comes from Karen Herman in Western Australia. She asks, how would you pitch to a school the importance of engaging artists in the classroom to work alongside educators? Often schools are fearful of engaging artists who may bring chaos to classrooms. How do we elevate the practice which assists teachers to deliver creative learning experiences? And I suppose the next question is, that occurs to me from Karen's question is, do we need to be relying on the kind of the artist in resident model, or are there other kinds of models that you've seen that you think might be more effective in terms of creative learning?
Yeah, that's a great question, Karen. I love it. And, sometimes a little, so I think, I was going to say sometimes a little chaos is okay, as long as we add some structure to it. I think the thing about artists that is really important, and it gets back to kind of just the very basic taproot of what do we even mean by creativity. Creativity is all about difference. What artists can allow us to do is take a different view of something, right? To give a different perspective, to actually elicit a different perspective out of us. And so I think what happens in school, because schools tend to privilege sameness, right? Schools are kind of the tradition of school is a pedagogy of sameness. Same kids in the same room with the same age and the same thing at the same time in the same way, right? So if we can introduce a little difference in that, a different way of thinking about something, a different way of representing something, and actually endorse that and show that that's a valuable thing to do, it can actually expand the depth of learning. So one of the earliest creativity researchers, Joy P. Guilford, who kind of was often credited with kind of starting the systematic study of creativity, often argued that creativity and learning are essentially the same phenomenon, right? They both involve change. They both involve developing something new and meaningful. And that just so happens to occur oftentimes at the kind of individual level. But I've kind of worked on this concept of creative learning to take it to the next level, which is if you allow people to express their own unique ways of understanding, and this includes artists coming in, right, their own kind of take on things, then it can actually contribute new and meaningful learning for the teacher and the peers of that student, or the peers that are kind of experiencing this artist in residence or this visiting artist. So the idea then is
creative learning is this kind of two-part process whereby we present young people with enough uncertainty that it provokes them to actually wrestle with what they're experiencing and try to make sense of it in light of what they already know and can do, giving them support so that they can kind of resolve that in their own unique way, sharing that out, having the stamina as educators and supporting peers in trying to understand this child's representation of it, and thereby potentially contribute creatively to the learning and lives of others. So artists are kind of a little kind of pebble in that certain shoe that we kind of walk with in schools, right? They add that little irritant, they add that little uncertainty that can kind of disrupt perspectives. So I would say, you know, I think artists in residence, if people are fortunate enough to have that, that's fantastic. But I also think we need to think much more broadly about the arts. Like Dewey talks about art, the art of experience, right? That art can be experienced in different spaces. So can we find these other spaces where we can have young people learn, right? Learn from artisans of all manners, right? Learn from the craft of cooking, learn from their families, right? How does that disrupt the learning, right? So I think difference, to the extent we can infuse difference in the curriculum, the more likely we are to accept and express creativity in that space. So artists can play a key role. But again, this is to be determined and demonstrated. I think it's on, the onus is on us to say this and let the kids speak. Because we had this artist come in, or we went to see this installation, or we went to this, you know, chef's kitchen and saw how they took this piece, all these ingredients, and turned it into an edible work of art, for example. What did I learn from that? How did that change my thinking about, you know, human digestion, or whatever the case may be, or why we eat healthy, or whatever the topic is? I think kids are in the best position to help others understand how those kinds of experiences are actually not only important to their learning, but important to learning and life, broadly speaking.
Thanks, Ron. There's another question from one of our Create members who's also just done a webinar, which is available on the YouTube site, which Thomas will put in the chat room. It's Alison Grove O'Grady. She asks, Ron, there's a wonderful synergy between the asking what if and the pedagogy of empathy using the magic if, which comes from Stanislavski. Can you speak a little about embodied pedagogy as part of the suite of creative competencies?
Yeah, so I'll share kind of my understanding of this. I really do think that teaching and learning are these kind of embodied acts, right? And so the interesting thing is we have Zoom. Zoom has a beautiful space. It became a nice portal to continue learning, and we're all gathered using it here. It was a way to kind of resolve the uncertainty we experienced. The problem is, I think we too readily accepted it and used it to resolve it. So what I would argue is there's something really important about the physicality of teaching and learning, of physical objects, of physical spaces. And so even if we're limited to this, we don't want this kind of portal of learning, this tool of learning to become the vehicle of learning. We want it to be a tool. So if we are limited to this tool in this current time, can we still use material objects? Can we be putting things together with our hands? Can we be taking our cameras outside, going to physical spaces, using and capitalize on the physicality of teaching and learning? So I would say there is this kind of broadly distributed embodiment that occurs. And to the idea of what if, I think what if is perhaps the most powerful way of giving feedback, of generating possibilities. You can give extremely difficult to hear, extremely candid feedback if you preface it with what if. And the reason why is it signals that it's just one possibility, take it or leave it, right? It's not accusatory like why. So you could try this in your personal life as well, you know, instead of like, why don't you help me with the dishes? You say, what if you help me with the dishes? It's just a suggestion, you know? But you could, if you teach young people how to preface their feedback to each other, their feedback to you, your feedback to them with what if, then it just generates possibilities, right? So I think that's what I try to infused into the classroom is using what if as much as possible, because it really does open up the vistas of thinking in different ways. And again, the person receiving that can decide whether or not to actually accept it, but it could be actually heard better if it is prefaced with what if. So I don't know, Allison, if that kind of resonates with what you were thinking, but thank you.
So that's kind of brings us to the end of the Q&A session, Ron. Thank you so much for your generous time and your insights. I think what we were hoping for with this first OnCon is that we'd come out with so many strategies and questions and provocations, and I think you've delivered that in spades. What I think we've seen today in that presentation is a really thoughtful, clear kind of call to action actually for educators and artists to think about ambiguity, to think about how we might deal with doubt and bring to our schools a real excitement that's born of creative learning. So thank you so much for your time today.